Hi there. What's more picture postcard and quintessentially Irish than a traditional thatched cottage? Yet I've only learned a lot about this recently, and I've asked myself the question, what are we doing to support this part of our cultural past and present into the future? Well, here to tell us a little bit about it is this week's special guest, Paul Hussey. Paul, thanks for agreeing to come on to Sunday Girl and for inviting all of us into your beautiful home here in County Clare. Tell us a little bit about your renovation of what's behind us here, Ornishka.
Okay, well, I originally drove past the cottage in around 2011, 2012 on a journey down through the coast. Took some time out, and on this drive along the coast of Clare, which I'd never been into, never explored, had driven past it and took old photographs of it, which again, you've seen the photos with the old blue door and the thatch in its condition, etc. Of which then later on, in coming back from France, I was living and working in France for a period. I then had the opportunity to buy it.
A very brave man indeed. You decided to take it on and to restore it, and that of course is because your profession as a project manager and in construction for so many years probably allowed you to do that. But we'll talk about your profession in a minute. Tell me first of all about the restoration, the purchase and the restoration of it.
Well, that's actually a very good point that you said, because the property had been vacant for a number of years because there wasn't many people that could, without the skills or the finances, take on such a deep project which needed extensive works, plus the landscaping and working in with the local Burren ecosystem, which was already in place, which is where we're sat now. In particular, that the pine marten was resident, and the local bat, etc., which in part of the planning and bringing the property back to life, then people had to be involved, which was very important.
And you started to slowly renovate it.
Moved in
And
the winter of 2014.
You actually moved in when you purchased
Moved
it?
into this section of the cottage.
Okay, which I think you have said to me that the original cottage that people would have lived in,
Yes.
and you said the 1800s, was originally this section of the cottage.
Yeah, I since found the records of the Griffiths archives, which I think was done around 1840, 1845, and then the tithe records, which were done previous to that.
Okay.
And it shows a very little small hamlet of cottages in Glenina, well, actually totaling around 800 dwellings. Glenina once was a very strong fishing village, this being one of the last of the fishermen's cottages, along this coast of North Clare, the Burren in the background, and overlooking Galway Bay. So that was its historic.
So when in its original form in the 1800s, the whole family would have lived literally in that section.
7 metres by 5 metres square, which was a typical average family dwelling, which averaged between 7 and maybe 9 members of a family. That was the average census record at the time.
Of course, they had their animals living with them as well, because their animals were their property.
Correct. And this side of the cottage would have been the old briar. This would have housed the animals. The animals and the and obviously the family, which were fishermen, would have brought in their fish stock and supplies, and obviously housed their fishing gear and nets, etc. From what I understand from the locals.
There wouldn't have been a foundation on the floor of the cottage then.
Built on solid Burren limestone.
Built on
bedrock.
Okay, that was the bedrock.
Pure bedrock.
And it would have been thatched using, I'm assuming, reed sourced locally.
Correct. And there's 3 different types: straw, wheat, and reed. The reed, for the predominant coastline of Clare and into North Kerry, was banked traditionally and historically off the Shannon. For numbers of centuries.
That's where the reed came from, it was off
Correct.
the Shannon. Okay.
Predominantly off the Shannon.
Okay. And it was grown there, and then obviously the local.
It's grown and farmed along the Shannon, up until there's been recent blights over the years, and in particular one blight around the period of me buying this cottage, which took out most of the reed. That then at a time, we had to then import the reeds from, I believe the sources were Turkey and Poland. We had to then bring in the fresh reed supplies of the 2 major importers again, which had to bring the reeds in.
Okay, so when you took over the cottage here and you bought it and you then began to restore it, I know that you were involved in thatching it yourself. Tell me more about that process. Where did you actually get the reed from for that?
Well, the first thing I did was I visited the Burren Heritage Centre in, as you know, South Clare, very close to the Shannon, which is a great source of historical fact and interest and live study because, and as they still have to this day, real thatchers on site, they're real thatchers, that are actually keeping the village of I think around 14 different thatched types of cottages, which are vernacular to the different regions of Ireland. It was that place at the folk ground where I met this then thatcher, which I think he's since retired, and he then introduced me and gave me a quick afternoon demonstration of how to thatch in a very simple format and in a very.
And you had no previous experience in how to thatch?
No, because I believed at the time that thatching was in all of us, and because historically, and most people from the countryside, all up throughout Ireland, would have once came from a thatched home. That was the.
I know
mass
my
tradition.
own granddad was born in a thatched home, and you said to me that your dad was
Correct.
born.
Yes.
Yeah,
in
a
Galway.
thatched home.
Yes.
Yeah, and you're all your family come
previous.
from the west of Ireland.
Yes.
Tell me the process then. So you started thatching it, and obviously you had to then renovate the inside as well. So talk us through that process.
Part of moving into 14 into 15 was the heavy storm, and in sleeping in this old part of the cottage, that the roof virtually collapsed. Which again, you've seen the photos, and
We'll share those here.
you'll be showing.
Yeah.
And it was pretty well decayed, and it was a shame really because this section of thatch roof was nearly 3 foot thick, of the layers of historic thatching which had been stitched on over time.
Now explain this a little bit more, because I found that fascinating when we started talking about it. So because this is an old cottage that you have restored over the many, many generations, it has been thatched. So layers have built up. And in between those layers, is there tin? Is there slate? What's between those layers?
Again, a very good point. A lot of historic thatch cottages, certainly those that date back to the early part of the 20th century, would have had a layer of thatch sandwiched with a sheet of tin roof. The tin coming from around the mid-1800s, when it was invented, 1830, 1840, and was latterly widely used sort of post-famine era, after a lot of the thatchers then went into decline and people left, etc. The tin was the only material that could cover it quick and get the works executed, and to try and preserve what was there, which is actually on this part of the cottage. We have a layer of tin, although not as old as the 1840, 1845 period. That tin process of sandwiching the thatch was continued to be used throughout the latter part of the 21st century.
So the original part of the cottage where everybody lived originally was built in the 1800s, and then the second part of the cottage was built in 1932.
Date stone found when I removed all of the render in part of the renovation process. And I don't actually like to use the word renovation. It was more about bringing it back to life.
In construction, and then you've worked at a senior level in project management, most recently in Dubai, where, I mean, here we have a one-story development that you've been passionate about, but I know in Dubai you oversaw the operations of constructing 100th-story developments. Tell us a little bit about your Dubai experience.
I was fortunate enough in 2017 to be offered a position to work with a very senior family who were also master developers and had coastal property interests. So the main part of Dubai, which would be Jumeirah, the Palm, etc., and oversee projects up to 100 floors tall, albeit luxury villas at ground level.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. Of course, Paul, this is really like coming full circle for you, isn't it? Your family is from the west of Ireland. Tell us a little bit about the past.
Well, my father's side of the family hail from Glenamaddy, a northeast part of Galway, famously known as the Four Roads to Glenamaddy. Growing up childhood was memories of travelling from England back to Ireland, where my father and his three brothers left in the 50s and into the 60s to work all in construction in that era of post-war.
As
Boom.
did many men
As did
and
many,
families.
and
I mean,
women.
that was a
Yeah.
time of.
Well, my father in particular was one of the engineers that had worked on the Great Spaghetti Junction project in Birmingham, which I think kicked off around 1966, 1967, was completed in around 72. It held a record at the time for one of the spaghetti coming from a mixture of intersections of highways and messy civil engineering successes, actually, which is what it later become. And it was a main intersection of the UK, which I think everybody's aware of. And also the famous rotunda in Birmingham. It was a round tower, which was built, I can't remember the floor levels, 30 odd floors, but the first round tower that was built, a bit like the Leaning Tower of Pizza, but not quite leaning. And the other one then famously was the famous GPO building of Birmingham, which was another tall structure, which again I think broke a record at the time of the tallest structure.
Your family also went stateside, and I know worked on a particularly iconic project there, of which we all know the iconic image. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, both sides of grandparents, family, grandfather and grandmother went out to New York, in specifically, as we all know, Manhattan, the famous island where they all got off and led off to their new lives. We found out later on and in recent years that one of those famous relatives on grandmother's side was a Raftree from Glenamaddy. Some of the family still remain there in Glenamaddy, and he's sat atop the beam in that great Photoshop and set-up scene which was taken at the time.
Thatch cottages really are part of our cultural heritage, and we really do want them to stay with us. But I know there is a number of challenges faced by the owners of thatch cottages today, and those who perhaps would like to build a thatch cottage or restore one. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Paul?
Number one, which I think is the way, and on behalf of most thatch cottage owners on social media who I've connected with, would be that there is a correct, counted and proper census done on the whole island of Ireland, in the north and the south, which incorporates and lists all of the properties here that are now current and in 2023 still standing and left on this island of Ireland, including the outer Aran Islands and all the other beautiful islands that surround our coast. Recommendation number two would be that we have a correct, affiliated government and private body. There are fragmented groups which are trying to represent each other. This should become one, and that it has a underwritten approach and equal thought belief of preserving the Irish vernacular thatched property. Third recommendation, and for me is most important, and as most people have thatched cottages that cannot get insurance, is a financial one, and that is that the government signs its cheque, gives it to the underwriters of Lloyd's of London, or seeks grant money from the European funding to help and support and underwrite an insurance policy that all thatched cottages or thatched property owners of Ireland can finally have and be equal to any other type of property, whether it's in the north or the south of the border.
I think that important one as well is like the government kind of does need to get out its checkbook, because there are people who are passionate about thatch cottages and are currently living in thatch cottages that don't have insurance. So they don't have access to the same rights that other home owners have. And I think that's a really, really important point to get across.
I think it's a sad thing in this day and age that people live at a complete risk of losing not only the roof over their heads but everything.
Their
by
contents.
Not
Everything.
Destroy. And it's this is well noted and now well documented in Ireland, and it does happen. It's happened most recently around here, and it can be brought on not just by lighting a thatch. It can be electrical blackout, storms, etc., that can trigger line fuse issues, which can trigger fires.
So easily.
Easily, very easily.
Paul, I think they're really practical recommendations. And listen, thank you so much for inviting us all in here to your beautiful home here in Glenina on the gorgeous Burren overlooking Galway Bay, and for sharing your story with us. And thank you so much for being this week's guest on Sunday Girl. And both of us wish you an amazing week.